Priceless ancient treasures torn out of the ground. Precious art ripped from walls and sold to the highest bidder.
22, 24, 26.
Welcome to a multi-billion-dollar black market nobody wants to talk about. Until now, the grandest of mankind's achievements reduced to obscene commodities. The spoils snatched up by wealthy collectors from shady middlemen, laundered through a network of liars and thieves. It's a global crime wave, where the cash ends up in the pockets of the world's worst criminals, while nobody asks the big questions. How can it still be happening? Welcome to a modern tragedy. History itself, dug up, destroyed, sold off. This is loot. To understand the scale of looting historical artifacts, look no further than modern Syria. Sophisticated and cynical religious invaders literally dig pieces from the ground and sell them to black market dealers in Western countries to buy weapons and fight a war against the same countries. Madness? Quite possibly.
The trade's main target buyers are, ironically, history enthusiasts and art aficionados in the United States and Europe, representatives of the societies which ISIS has pledged to destroy.
But when zealotry combines with political instability and a lack of international courage, the very history of the world becomes a commodity.
People need to realize that they're taking part in international crime. If they stop buying, then they stop the market. There will be no need for the market. It will become unfashionable.
Welcome to Loot in Syria, a multi-billion-dollar murderous mess. And it isn't finished yet. Ground Zero, Syria, an ancient land blessed with stunning archaeological wealth.
So Syria has always been this important area, both for settlement and for trade, and then obviously also for invasion. So I think that's why archaeologically it's a very rich area.
Home to a dazzling past and a proud country. It's the perfect setting for any ambitious, fanatical religious group to gain a foothold.
The big moment came during the start of the war in Syria in 2011, when very early on, cultural heritage became a casualty of the war itself.
For Syria, 2011 will be a fateful year. And it will be D-Day for its priceless cultural heritage. ISIS. This savage terrorist organization goes by many names. Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, ISIL. It's a stomping ground for madmen, misfits, and murderers. Their plan? To drag the world back into the Dark Ages and to establish an Islamic caliphate within a politically vulnerable Syria. But behind their brutality, Islamic State is fighting a very modern war. Their weapon of choice? Social media. But how does an organization like ISIS help fund an invasion? That's right, with the proceeds of looted ancient treasures.
How much ISIS earns from looting ancient artifacts is difficult to assess. The group clearly encourages and facilitates the trade.
And the biggest irony, the riches pouring into their coffers will come from the same people they're hell-bent on slaughtering, while those trying to stem the tide will face scenes of appalling horror and immeasurable loss. It all starts during what will become known as the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring started in Tunisia, with people in Tunisia taking the streets because they were upset about the political and economic situation.
December 2010. A fruit seller in Tunisia sets himself alight in a desperate protest against the country's brutal autocratic regime. His suicide sparks violent protests across the country.
There's extraordinary anger here mixing with the smell of tear gas. Either this is the first Arab revolution of the 21st century, or it will be brutally suppressed.
It feels like change is in the air. Long repressed people across the Middle East and North Africa follow Tunisia's lead. They rise en masse.
Then it continued to Egypt, Yemen, Sudan, and I think it has affected a lot the views of cultural heritage.
In Egypt, thousands of protesters converge onto Tahrir Square. Government forces fight back. They let gas canisters and rubber bullets do the talking.
There are plenty of people here bent on confrontation. They, of course, would call it retaliation.
Inspired by what they see happening across the Middle East, Syrians take to the streets. A bloody military crackdown will lead to tens of thousands of civilian deaths, millions displaced, and a protracted civil war. A festering wound has been opened within Syrian society, ready for radical Islamists to infect. And Syria's peerless ancient past will bear the brunt of it all.
The Arab Spring has affected heritage positively and negatively. Negatively, it raised the rate of looting, it raised the rate of land grabbing, where many of the archaeological sites were taken for unplanned development, for illegal land sale.
The men and women in the streets record everything and broadcast it to the world. It's a social media revolution. Protesters communicate and organize online. And there's precious little the government can do to shut them down. It changes the way the world reports and consumes its news. You don't need a cadetship to become a frontline reporter. All you need is a cell phone. It's a shot across the bows for traditional media. To compete with bloggers and YouTubers, they'll have to dish up the same clickbait. And that will play right into Islamic State's hands. Social media will become a formidable weapon in their armory. It'll be used not just to recruit, but also to loot. It's not the first time social upheaval, war, and invasion have offered opportunities for rampant looting.
The removal of art and cultural heritage kind of furthers this destructive advance that comes from conflict and control. So the Romans, for example, there's plenty of evidence, even in Roman art, of Romans sacking and pillaging the areas they conquer and bringing home symbolic spoils. This has been a feature of conflict for millennia. It seems to be something that people do to subjugate others, is to take their culture and heritage.
In modern times, the graph continues, as Syrian government soldiers gladly take kickbacks for studiously ignoring the frenzied plundering of ancient sites. Rebels swap loot for weapons in Lebanon, and Free Syrian Army brigades take a cut of the antiquities trade in the areas they control.
There was a pre-existing looting culture, if you like. There was a culture of illicit trade and looting already established in Syria. There were dealers already in place. There were routes in place. There were smugglers in place. In a way, what Daesh did, I think they came in and they took control of what in the past had been an illegal network, and they effectively legalized it.
Essentially, when they first started to take over cities and territories in Syria, they came upon a pre-existing situation with regards to looting of antiquities. That was already ongoing. They didn't start that.
But Islamic State will take the art of looting to a whole other level. If they're going to get the caliphate of their dreams, the treasure chest hidden beneath Syria's ancient soil will deliver the cash they need to fund it.
The taking of these materials and the supporting of these networks of looting result in the killing of human beings. And this became very clear with ISIS. They turned this into a trade through which they could support the purchasing of weapons, the enslaving of people, and the killing of others.
A decade earlier, the insurgency that rips Iraq apart after the 2003 U.S. invasion had much to teach Islamic State. It is a lesson in looting that'll serve them well in years to come. The ground beneath their feet is a treasure trove.
The illicit trade in antiquities and other cultural objects really began to be perceived as a problem, I think, for the international community generally. The objects being taken, they were large, historically important or artistically important objects, and they'd be going into major museums in North America or Europe. So the actions that followed and policy that followed tended to focus on large art treasures. So whereas back in the 60s, it wasn't really worth anybody's while to go digging out small antiquities in a site somewhere and then transport them onto the market. Now it is profitable because they can be sold on the internet, they can be sold over social media.
But Islamic State learned something else in Iraq. Large and well-known antiquities are expensive to move and difficult to sell. But smaller artifacts dug fresh out of the ground, that's another story.
So in a way, I think the mindset behind public policy is still thinking in terms of treasures, they're thinking in terms of big auction houses, they're thinking in terms of big museums, and they're not really focused on the fact that a lot of the trade now is in small objects which won't be sold at major auction houses, they won't enter major museums, they're going to enter small collections, but they're still generating money, they're still generating large amounts of money which can be used by groups such as Daesh and other armed groups, to further their violence.
In 2013, ISIS makes its move in Syria by inserting itself into the ongoing civil war. While its fight against the Assad regime develops, ISIS will cleverly fund its war with profits from smaller artifacts that are easily moved and marketed. Syria's archaeological landscape is one of a kind. Antiquity is part of the texture of everyday life. It's one of the things that makes Syrian antiquity so special. But it also makes it vulnerable. With more than 15,000 archaeological sites in Syria, it's an embarrassment of riches. But when those objects are stolen, the knowledge they represent is lost forever.
Cultural objects without the people they represent, without the cultures that they represent, you just have an aesthetic object, but there's no history, there's no collection. It's dead. It's just a dead artifact.
In Syria, every spadeful of dirt can turn up a bucket load of ancient objects like these. They're hardly in short supply. So does it really matter if some of them are shipped out of the country? Should collectors feel guilty about where they've come from and from whom?
There is an argument that's made in some areas of the art world and the dealing of antiquities and the collecting of antiquities that these activities save these objects from destruction, usually in areas of conflict.
People say, but we are saving these objects. We're keeping them here in the safe haven of the West.
One of the first problems with this argument is that it very conveniently gives people an excuse to do exactly what they want to do. It very conveniently gives people an excuse to break the law.
Cultural heritage and antiquities obviously belong in their own context. The idea that you can somehow separate a cultural artifact just seems fundamentally wrong.
But unfortunately, if these items move into the private market, there's no guarantee they're going to be protected either.
So this idea of we are saving the object is actually a bigger crime, because you are destroying the whole site in exchange of the object that you want to keep in your cabinet of curiosities.
But there's never any shortage of people willing to turn a blind eye. So as fighting reaches fever pitch across Syria, looters are primed and ready to go. Islamic State's plan for world domination begins with its own nation-state. For the people forced to live under its rule, it will be a living hell. So strict is their interpretation of Islam, even Al-Qaeda disowns them. In June 2014, Islamic State gets its wish. They announce a caliphate in Syria and northern Iraq. Eventually, they'll control an area the size of Austria and impose their brutal rule on almost 8 million victims. But they won't stop there. The aim is to take their twisted ideology to the world. Social media is their outlet of choice. ISIS takes its murderous campaign to the world. Over 2,000 people will be murdered outside Iraq and Syria in more than 140 terrorist attacks.
Particularly that attack, which was absolutely terrible, which had focused and targeted children and young people, which was absolutely appalling.
Other lives will be lost in sickening televised executions. Most people recoil from the horror, but for some, it's a rallying cry. By 2015, Islamic State signs up 80,000 fighters. With an army of that size, the threat to Syrian heritage looms large. Dr. Amr al-Azam is one of Syria's most accomplished archaeologists. And as ISIS swarms over the Syrian landscape, taking control of city after city, he is deeply worried. He will eventually go on to help the international fight against looting. But now, his focus is on protecting one of Syria's most precious museums.
If it happened in Iraq, it could also happen here. And I'm sitting in a museum, and I'm looking at my museum, and I'm thinking, wow, all right, this is what happened in Iraq, and we could be next. We decided that we needed to put a plan in place, a contingency plan, both in terms of how we would quickly respond and adapt, and also how we might be able to recover these items if they ever got looted. And then I got called up by someone from the security services, said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, you know, we're trying to put this contingency plan. You saw what happened in Iraq," and I was really excited, and I was explaining. And the guy just listened to me and listened, and he said, "Okay, you will cease and desist immediately. You are instigating unhealthy thoughts. This is defeatist talk, as if something like that could possibly happen in Syria."
But the museum is doomed. Amr, sensing the inevitable, manages to escape to Lebanon. Now, from outside of Syria, what can he do to help save the country's unique heritage?
In terms of how we started to get material, one of the things, my initial concern, and that's going back as early as 2012, 2013, was really out of a response to pleas for help from friends and colleagues inside Syria. They were calling us, what can we do? How can we save these items? How do we protect our museums? How do we protect our sites? So my initial involvement was mainly with that. As we started to sort of connect with each other, and essentially we established this network of cultural heritage, if you will, activists, archaeologists, museum curators, etc., within Syria, and mainly in areas back then outside regime control. And remember, by 2015, 2016, the Syrian regime controlled less than 30% of the country. The scale of the looting was catastrophic, and you could see it on satellite images, you could see it with photographs that people were going out and documenting the destruction, the looting, and they were sending it to us, and in turn we were using this information, I was using that information to try and draw attention, raise awareness about what was going on, the damage that was happening to Syria's history and culture.
In ISIS-occupied territory, the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud has stood for almost 3,500 years. It's also blessed with some of the world's most iconic ancient works of art.
What ISIS did with the selling of antiquities was obviously very cynical, because on the one side that they were saying all of this is religious and it should be destroyed, and on the other hand they were, was the basis of their economy.
In April 2015, Islamic State ratchets up their propaganda machine.
The UN says this cultural cleansing constitutes a war crime.
But those of us who were watching from a distance were also completely devastated by what was happening. At the time, I was working on writing my textbook, and it was particularly difficult because as I was writing the chapter on Nimrud, it was exactly the same time that Nimrud was exploded. And it took all the strength I had just to move on, to write the next line, to just continue to write this book so that there would be some record of it going forward, so that future generations of students could learn about this.
When ISIS is done, over 70% of the ancient city is flattened. And they broadcast every blow online. UNESCO condemns it as an atrocity, but that won't bring it back. It's a big win for Islamic State propaganda, and the Western media plays into their hands. The world's reaction tells them that they've hit their mark. For Syrian archaeologists, it's a grim foreshadowing of things to come. The jewel in the Syrian archaeological crown is the ancient city of Palmyra, on the hub of trade routes that join the Roman Empire with Persia, India, and China. It was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. And ISIS has it firmly in its sights.
Well, Palmyra is this amazing city in the desert. It's obviously very famous. It's listed as one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites.
Palmyra is one of the most amazing sites. It was a multicultural world where people practiced many religions and spoke many languages in antiquity, and one of the most beautiful places in Syria.
One man has devoted his life to this most precious of places. Khaled al-Assad.
Well, the best way to describe Khaled al-Assad, I think, in the most simple terms, is he was Mr. Palmyra, and had been involved in the archaeology and restoration of the main site from its earliest days as a young man, and then became the head of its antiquities department.
The ancient ruins are surrounded by the modern city of Palmyra, which is where Khaled has lived and worked for over 50 years. In 2015, Khaled's world will literally come crashing down.
When ISIS invaded the city, many people, including his sons and his family, fled the city, and in the process also tried to save some of the most valuable items or objects from the museum.
With Islamic State fighters nearing the outskirts of the city, Khaled al-Assad packs up his family and sends them running with as many priceless artifacts as they can carry. But Khaled stays behind. Palmyra is in his blood, and he's not going to abandon it. May 2015, the city of Palmyra falls. And right outside its gates, one of the most perfectly preserved ancient sites on the planet. It's a well-orchestrated plan. Anything that can't be moved will be destroyed. Everything else will be sold.
Evidence that ISIS has sanctioned the looting and sale of antiquities to generate revenue for terrorism is a game changer.
I saw things online, for instance, from Palmyra being sold, which was kind of ironic considering literally at the same time Palmyra was being overrun by ISIS. So you had these kinds of things happening all at the same time and no one seemed to be paying attention to that.
But if the world wasn't paying attention before, ISIS will make sure it's paying attention now. With a vast area now under its control, Islamic State is raking in funds from the usual sources: oil sales, taxes, and real estate. But being terrorists, they'll also go places sovereign nations won't. And with at least 4,500 cultural sites under its control, Syria's ancient past is just another resource to be exploited.
So these guys were obviously making a lot of money because they were investing in the machinery, in the fuel that you need to run the machinery, in the crews that are doing the digging and extracting this material. And they were going literally, site after site after site.
Scooping up the loot isn't left to chance. Documents seized in a U.S. Special Forces raid reveal an organizational flowchart better suited to an accountancy firm than a terrorist group hell-bent on mayhem. And the head loot scooper is Abu Sayyaf. After climbing the Islamic State corporate ladder, Sayyaf is handed control of the Diwan al-Rikaz. Literally, the Department of Precious Things that come out of the ground. That means oil and antiquities.
ISIS sees cultural heritage as a resource to be exploited like any other. And we know this because ISIS has a dedicated department for the administration of the looting of antiquities. You can see here, for example, this is one of their offices in the city of Manbij.
In the beginning, Abu Sayyaf and his band of jihadists aren't planning on getting their hands dirty. They sell licenses to those who want to do the digging. All they ask in return? A 20% cut.
When ISIS was issuing these looting licenses and requiring in return that you pay a 20% tax on your profit. But then we see an evolution in that from initially simply issuing out licenses to people and allowing them to continue to loot, to getting more organized in terms of getting involved in the sale itself. So we see this gradual evolution from initially just issuing licenses, that's the institutionalization process of looting, to ultimately an industrialization of the process, an intensification, where now you're bringing in bulldozers, you're bringing in entire crews, you're involved in this looting, trafficking, and sale of antiquities at every single level of the process. And if you don't think that this is producing good material, here are some of the finds that came out of this one licensed site that was being looted. Not only these pieces of pottery, but also these items all coming from a Bronze Age tomb complex.
By 2014, almost 2.5 million Syrian refugees have fled into Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, even Iraq. And for those left behind, desperation is growing. The country is in freefall, and Abu Sayyaf doesn't have any trouble finding willing helpers. For some Syrians, it's a matter of survival.
In a conflict zone like Syria, are these mostly, or in many cases, subsistence looters trying to just find something they can then somehow sell to make a little bit of money.
Because the preservation of history won't feed their families.
People have lost their livelihoods, they've lost their fields, they've lost their crops, they've lost their jobs at factories or schools or whatever, then they start digging around and looting.
Before long, Syria's landscape is pockmarked and scarred. It's looting on an industrial scale.
When you bring in machinery, when you hire people to do the labor, you're essentially investing money. And you're not going to put money into something unless you're getting a profit, a return on it.
Starving Syrians are reduced to looting their country's past for one reason. Wealthy foreigners have a taste for Syrian antiquities.
The more there is a market, the more looting is going to continue. I understand that many communities suffer difficult economic situation.
But how exactly can ISIS get their loot to market? Once again, the terrorists surprise the world with their social media prowess.
We noticed this new phenomenon emerging, and that was the fact that these looted items were now starting to show up as images that were being sent on social media platforms like WhatsApp.
I would see messages on WhatsApp, you know, from dealers trying to sell things.
So that's transformed, I think, the way material is bought and sold in the region. The traffickers, they kind of co-opt the technology. eBay was used, and Facebook was used.
Well, I think technology and social media have been, you know, kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, maybe it's easier to track things by using temporary technology. On the other hand, things that are looted in any country can be sold internationally.
Amr soon realizes there is something very significant about all these social media posts.
Between late 2014, early 2015, you have this explosion of people on Facebook essentially trafficking in looted antiquities. The initial process started off as gathering as many images from would-be middlemen, dealers, etc., who were in possession of these photos and then basically collecting them and archiving them. Because I very quickly understood that this is the only time we're ever going to see this stuff. That's the only record we have of this item, this cultural heritage item that had never been seen since it was buried in the ground.
For Islamic State, it's a win-win. They flog whatever they can behind the scenes and destroy the things they can't to win points in the propaganda war. In 2014, the U.S. Congress is told that the sale of antiquities is Islamic State's second biggest money spinner behind oil sales. It'll even get to the point where social media sites are publishing the equivalent of looting for dummies guides.
Videos are uploaded, sometimes showing people how they're looting and instruction manuals effectively on what looting that's happening. I even saw a video of a guy doing this kind of funny-looking dance as he's looting a site with a metal detector. So all kinds of things you can see pretty much online. And you know, Facebook certainly is not helping, let's just say.
Abu Sayyaf, now curator of Islamic State's own antiquities department, takes advantage of looting at classical sites. He knows that Greek and Roman ruins mean finding conveniently small and potentially high-value items like coins and jewelry. It's a smart move. The Mediterranean is full of Greco-Roman sites. So small Roman artifacts, they could come from anywhere. And identifying them as loot is tricky. It's also easy and cheap to smuggle a coin or ring across a border. Most buyers of these artifacts have no idea they're handling stolen objects, and they certainly don't know their money is funding Islamic State's ghastly mission.
The trade's main target buyers are, ironically, history enthusiasts and art aficionados in the United States and Europe, representatives of the societies which ISIS has pledged to destroy.
But can ignorance of these artifacts' dubious origins continue to be used as an excuse?
So I think if people begin to associate that kind of conflict with antiquities themselves, then hopefully there'd be a bit of a conscience in people that would prevent them from being bought in the first place.
As world authorities clamp down on the illegal trade, Islamic State responds by using encrypted messaging services such as WhatsApp.
So if you look at the content of these Facebook groups, you'll find someone will post an object or an item for sale. There's often coded language for how they do it, and as soon as somebody gets interested, after 2 or 3 posts, you'll see, let's talk privately.
I hate to sort of jump on and everyone's beating up Facebook bandwagon, but certainly it's true. They are certainly perpetuating, and I'm sure if we look at these leaked documents that have come out recently, we would find something about the antiquities being another area which Facebook has not clamped down on.
It's a way around the inconvenient fact that glorious ancient objects don't just appear out of thin air. If it's an important piece, it will have been studied, exhibited, and written about.
In the history of art and archaeology, we use the term provenance to describe the history of an object that's been around for a long time, the history of a work of art or an antiquity that has been known for a couple of 100 years.
For historians, archaeologists, those who study the past, provenance is probably among the most important things to have. It provides context where something is from.
Even the most amoral auction house staffer or dealer won't put up a major piece for sale without a backstory or some sort of history.
Within the study of cases of trafficking of antiquities, we've been able to document a lot of false provenances, a lot of false backstories, a lot of fake stories that have been developed by these Janus figures and other intermediaries to mask the illicit origins of antiquities and to make a plausible story of legality for collectors and other buyers to buy into, to conveniently to believe, so to speak.
With looted objects, that documentation can and often is fabricated by the dealers and middlemen who take the loot to market.
They're not necessarily completely believable, but they're just enough for a buyer to suspend their disbelief or to cover their own potential culpability when it comes to buying loot. You also see attempts to move antiquities through multiple different transit ports, so multiple different cities and locations, so that it can gain paperwork as it moves through these transit ports.
It's 2015, and thanks to a U.S. Special Forces raid, Abu Sayyaf's methods are revealed. The 7 terabytes of material they find is the largest intelligence haul in special operations history. Amongst the data is a catalog featuring thousands of small but incredibly valuable objects. By focusing on these small Greek and Roman objects, Abu Sayyaf and his team were able to evade law enforcement, which tends to target big-ticket items. By August 2015, half of Palmyra has been razed, and Khaled al-Assad's life work shockingly vandalized, as seen in news reports from around the globe.
And when you come into the museum hall itself here, the thing that strikes you, above all else, is the particularity of the destruction. Okay, look at this. This isn't war. This is politics. The eyes and the face, gone. The body, the carving work there, intact. Next door, the face, gone. The carving of the body, intact.
Khaled has remained in the city until the end. He must have known what was coming.
ISIS, being what they are, eventually decided to arrest him and executed him, just in the most hideous, horrible way. I think there was, that day they executed 8 or 9 people, and he was one of them. They just, killed them and left their body, beheaded them, and then left his body hanging there.
Days after Khaled's murder, militants roll barrels of explosives into the 2,000-year-old Temple of Baal Shemin.
Cultural genocide is a reality, and it has a long, long history. It's not something new, and it's not something unique to one specific group or another. In the case of ISIS, it was all stage managed. It was all part of this kind of what I call cultural heritage atrocity. They commit atrocities. It's the narrative that I am able to act with impunity, and you, the international community, the rest of the world, the local community, are impotent to prevent me from doing that.
If Nimrud was the rehearsal, Palmyra will be the main event. Its greatest monuments are razed to the ground, and its epic amphitheater is used to stage bloody mass executions. As the news hits headlines across the globe, the world reacts in horror. In 2015, ISIS continues its murderous attacks around the world. In a case of twisted irony, ISIS uses the millions plundered from the illicit trade with the West to fund attacks on the West. November the 13th, a coordinated string of bombings and mass shootings in multiple locations across Paris kills 130 people. Global law enforcement wants answers. How are these elaborate attacks financed? Terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda were kept afloat by obscenely wealthy donors. But Islamic State is different. It has a large, well-resourced territory to pillage. Amr al-Azam and his fellow academics are on the case as they try to work out how much money Islamic State might be getting through its looting activities. By looking at the 4,000-year-old city of Tel Bia, U.S. academics estimate how much Syria's ancient past might be worth in dollar terms. About 10% of the Bronze Age site was excavated by archaeologists before the Civil War. They calculate that the antiquities they found would be worth about $4 million on the open market. That's one tiny proportion of one modest archaeological site in a country with 15,000 or so others. Multiply that across Syria and Iraq, that's a vast sum of money. Amr and his colleagues lobby the UN and other international bodies in a desperate bid to put a stop to the cultural carnage.
As part of this whole push against ISIS, the UN Security Council, it basically banned the sale and trafficking of any antiquities coming out of Iraq and Syria.
While that may be a good start, world governments need to be aware that it's the smaller artifacts that are slipping through the net.
So I think policymakers have a problem, and they have difficulty coming to terms with the idea that what they really need to be focused on aren't major art treasures. It's kind of, if you like, the bric-a-brac of antiquity.
On May the 16th, 2015, a pre-dawn military raid nets them the top dog. Leader of the ISIS antiquities market, Abu Sayyaf, is shot and killed. Left in his wake is a treasure trove of information about his operations and clues for chasing down the artifacts Islamic State has sent out of Syria.
I think it was very good that suddenly there was some documentary evidence of the value of the trade to Daesh.
Amr al-Azam and his colleagues are also using technology to chase down the people buying and selling Syria's cultural heritage online.
I created this tool to look at sites like eBay, for instance, where we use machine learning, natural language processing to effectively inform what kind of objects are being sold online to better track the trade of antiquities. So at least we can get a sense of where illegal sales are happening. At least we can try to stop them.
But they're facing an uphill battle. Law enforcement is only looking for high-profile prosecutions, and the media is only interested in big headlines. Many of the things stolen from Syria don't fit the bill.
And then, of course, this type of material is a lot easier to transport And it seems to me, you know, I mean, material's just smuggled out any way you want. I said before, it can be in a rucksack on somebody's back. It can be hidden in a car. It can, you know, it can be sent by mail.
In 2020, Facebook responds to accusations that it's operating as a bazaar for the trade in looted antiquities. It bans the sale of all historical artifacts on its site.
So we found groups that were posting material that we knew was clearly looted and trafficked looted material. And we contacted Facebook and said, hey, look, this is a problem. And we did this several times, and every time it would come back, no, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't contravene our community standard. So clearly, this is not something they're interested in doing. It was just a publicity stunt, low-hanging fruit.
With Facebook not coming to the party and world authorities struggling to legislate and prosecute effectively, new conflicts throughout the region offer looters new opportunities.
Conflict destabilizes the fabric of society that tends to protect cultural heritage. On the one hand, as competent authorities disappear, security goes away. The ability to monitor sites and prevent looting is gone.
As for the best way to protect what's left, the people on the front line in the battle to protect cultural heritage share a dream.
I think we enjoy culture, we study culture, we interact with culture. But buying culture, I think, needs to become an unethical crime. We need to start with the end user, which is the West. People need to realize that they're taking part in international crime. If they stop buying, then they stop the market. There will be no need for the market. It will become unfashionable.
Meanwhile, in Syria, the war goes on. 500,000 people have lost their lives. And in 2018, it was estimated that over a quarter of the population had fled the country. Islamic State, which lost its caliphate, is still a force. The United Nations has said that over 10,000 militants remain active in Syria and Iraq. The human cost of the civil war is overwhelming, and the loss of cultural heritage is dire. For many Syrians, their identity is bound to their past. At all costs, their past must be preserved for the sake of their future.